Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Esri GeoDev webinar series. About 2 years ago, we started this series as a way to continue engaging in developer-related topics and discussions in between dev summits. Speaking of which, we have our next developer summit coming up in Berlin, November 6th through 8th. We have a lot of new topics, advanced features, and additional functionality to share with you over the next coming months, so be sure to stay connected with us through our GeoDev webinar series page on go.esri.com/geodev or any of our social media accounts at Esri GeoDev. We would love to have conversations like these taking place throughout the year so that when we do meet at one of these Dev Summit conferences, it will be as though we never stopped. We hope you get as much or more out of this webinar than you anticipated. And now we would like to introduce you to today's webinar, Build Cross-Platform Mobile Mapping Apps with .NET and Xamarin. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. We've taken a screenshot of an example of the attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this on your own computer desktop in the upper right corner. You're listening in using your computer speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the phone, just select Use Telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. I would now like to introduce Rich Swap, Software Development Engineer for Runtime SDK for .NET, and Thad Tilton, Product Engineer at Esri. Thad, let's get started, shall we?
Absolutely. Thank you, Amy. So as Amy mentioned, my name is Thad Tilton. I'm a product engineer with the ArcGIS Runtime SDK for .NET team, and Rich is a dev on that same team and our Xamarin expert. So let's look at what we're going to talk about today. I know this will be a review for a lot of you, but we're going to start with a sort of a Xamarin overview for those of you that aren't familiar with the technology, and kind of give you some context here and talk about what Xamarin is and why you would use it, sort of the tools that it provides for you. For lack of a better term, I would call this the boring part of the webinar. And then after that, I'm going to hand it over to Rich, who will do the exciting part of the webinar and actually get his hands dirty building a Xamarin app almost from the ground up, pretty much from scratch with a little bit of cheating here and there with copy and paste. But he's going to target 3 different platforms. So he's going to build a cross-platform Xamarin app for iOS, Android, and Windows UWP. And you'll see some best practices as well. You'll see some good design using MVVM to make sure that, to facilitate code sharing across these platforms. And one of the things I really like about Rich's demo is he's going to show you what I would consider sort of a real world example of how devs do their work, which is we find some resources where there's some code already waiting for us, and we borrow that code and we hunt around for things that can help us get started. And so he's going to sort of cobble things together from a variety of sources that we provide with the SDK. All right, so let's start with a Xamarin overview. And again, I know for some of you this will be a review, but what is it? It's a software suite for cross-platform .NET development. It allows you to create native UI that are specific to each platform, and there's a couple options for how you do that we'll look at. And of course, the big advantage with Xamarin is you get to share your business logic across platforms. So really, I would say one of the advantages that Xamarin provides for cross-platform development is it gives you, fantastic code sharing without having to settle for a lowest common denominator experience. So yeah, if you're putting together a proof of concept app and you want to get something up quickly, you can do something that might not look great across all platforms, but it doesn't mean you have to settle for that. Xamarin has a lot of tools and has a lot of power to dive in and really make these look like native apps on every platform that you target. So more information about Xamarin. Obviously, there's a lot to look at there that I can't cover here in a couple slides, but good information on Microsoft Docs. Silly me, I put a link here in the slide thinking that you could click that and go to it. So the URL is hidden there, but at the end of the webinar here, I'll have a slide with all the resources that I discuss here, and you'll see those URLs laid bare for you to take note of. So what does Xamarin provide for you specifically? Some libraries for iOS and Android. So mono.net, which is an open source version of .NET for non-Windows platforms. This is a project that's been going on for some time, and now managed by Microsoft as an open source project. Platform bindings that surface the native iOS and Android APIs to C++. Some abstraction libraries, probably the most common ones being Xamarin Forms and Xamarin Essentials. We'll talk a little bit more about those in a bit. A lot of the magic happens here with the compiler. So since your code base is just one, code base of C# code in Visual Studio, we need to have some magic happen here that will produce the native apps from that single code base. So the compiler takes care of that and also has some optimization for your deployment. Again, I'd refer you to the Microsoft docs if you want the gory details on how some of that stuff works. The face of Xamarin, of course, is the development tools that you use, Visual Studio, either for Windows or for Mac. So you can choose to use either one. I think there's several things that might go into that choice. Of course, it might be made for you depending on what you're trying to target. If you're targeting Universal Windows, UWP, for example, you're going to need to run on Windows. So that choice has been made for you. But if you're targeting Android and iOS, for example, you could choose either one. Just be aware that for iOS, you will need a Mac machine to compile. So even if you can still do your development on Visual Studio for Windows, but you're going to have a Mac involved somewhere in there to help you compile your code. So let's get back to this idea of abstraction libraries. So this is kind of an important aspect of Xamarin. Even though you can obviously get into platform-specific stuff with Xamarin, the abstraction libraries kind of abstract a lot of those details from you for how those each platform handles those kind of details. So Xamarin Forms, for example, is a UI toolkit that abstracts how the different platforms will render certain types of controls. And what it allows you to do is define your UI using XAML. Sorry, it's not the same XAML you'd use for WPF or UWP. It's similar, but it's not exactly the same. But you can define that once, and then each platform decides how it's going to render that. And you can see from the screenshot that even though I've defined that time picker control just once using some XAML, well, each platform will render that, natively. Xamarin Essentials is similar to that, but this is for non-UI stuff. So I need to get to common device features. Obviously, a lot of these are relevant to GIS apps like Compass and getting my GPS location and things like that. So again, I don't have to worry about how it actually happens on the device. I can use this abstracted Essentials library and just write that code once and have the platform decide how it's going to implement it. Lots more information on the Microsoft Docs site, and again, I'll have the specific URLs for that at the end. I think you can probably figure out by now what we can do with Xamarin. It's really for building .NET apps that run on these various platforms. So in Rich's demo, he's going to show you iOS, Android, and UWP. You can develop for Mac OS using Xamarin. Just be aware that that is not something you can do with the ArcGIS Runtime SDK. So write code using C# in Visual Studio, sharing code across platforms, and leveraging platform-specific capabilities as you need them. We looked at Xamarin Forms, so of course you can write your UI using Xamarin Forms and XAML, and then just share that markup sort of as one UI across the different platforms. Be aware that you can also write platform-specific UI if you prefer to go that route. So the same way you define a UI for these other platforms, that will work in Visual Studio with Xamarin as well. So if you have an AXML file that you've put together for an Android app or one of your Android developers has put together, you can bring that right into your project and use that. Same with storyboards for iOS and of course UWP XAML. Why would you use it? I think we probably have a pretty good idea of why you'd use it here. There's lots of reasons you could point to, but really I think it boils down to two main reasons. For most of us, I think number one is probably relevant here. We're familiar with C# and Visual Studio. We like that development environment. We're comfortable with C#, Visual Studio. That's where we want to do our development, and we can use those tools across all these platforms. And then we can take advantage of code sharing for cross-platform development. All right, let's turn just real quickly to ArcGIS Runtime. Again, there's a lot of information that could be covered here, so I'll refer you to developers.arcgis.com/net. That's where you'll find the landing page for the Runtime SDK for .net. Lots of good information there. So we have APIs for iOS, Android, and Xamarin Forms, which supports UWP. The great thing about these APIs is it's one common .NET API surface, which means the code you write is going to be the same regardless of those platforms. Obviously facilitates code sharing, and especially if you're using a solid design pattern like MVVM, it really can make your life a lot easier. So the Runtime SDK, of course, provides high performance mapping, visualization. You can use online services and content. One great thing about this, and you'll see this in Rich's demo, you could create your map using ArcGIS Online and kind of do all of your cartography work there, and you can just suck that online map or hosted feature services straight into your app. You might need to work offline. You can do that as well. So maybe you have like a field work type scenario where you need to have people go out with local data disconnected, make some edits, push that back to your online data sources. That works too. And of course, you can get to all of the device sensors and things that are running natively on the devices and use that in your app as well. GPS, of course, probably being one of the obvious ones. So here's some of the resources that I think you'll find useful. And again, I just want to throw these up sort of before Rich's demo because you'll see him touch on all of these, and some great stuff that you'll find at all of these, from documentation to samples, toolkit controls, tutorials to kind of step you through some basic tasks, and all the way up to full-blown, open source example apps with full Xamarin implementations cross-platform that you can look at and learn from. Okay, with that concludes what I would call the boring part of our webinar. Now we get to have some fun and see some code. Rich, you want to build an app for us?
All right. Yeah, sure thing. Let me just switch over here. All right, great. Thanks, Thad. Yeah, so let's build an app. Now that you've had a little overview of what Xamarin is and what the ArcGIS Runtime is and how Xamarin figures into that, I want to actually show you what building a cross-platform .NET and Xamarin app is all about. So what do I want to build here to demonstrate that? I'm actually going to jump over to the browser to start. And our scenario here, here I'm in ArcGIS Online. I have a web map. And the scenario here is that we have a bunch of tree survey data, in this case, for the city of Portland. And one common scenario, one common task for our field workers here is they need to go out to a particular neighborhood and have a look at trees that have been flagged as dead or very sick to see if some kind of follow-up action is needed. So I want to kind of build an app to help facilitate them doing that. And the workflow I want to go with here is to have the user select the neighborhood they want to visit, and then have the app calculate a route for them to visit all those distressed trees, and then actually help navigate them to those trees. So that all sounds well and good, but how are we actually going to do that? So I actually started probably the same place many of you would start, with our one of our ArcGIS Runtime project templates for Visual Studio. So I'm going to jump into the development environment here, and you'll see that I have a solution with 4 projects. This was created from, more specifically, our ArcGIS Runtime project template for Xamarin Forms using .NET Standard. And the 4 projects you get with that, you'll see we have 1 each for Android, iOS, and UWP. But those, really, you don't have to worry much about those. They're essentially just boilerplate code. They're compiler targets where each one essentially compiles down to the executable needed to run the app on each of those platforms. The real meat and potatoes of this solution is in this project up at the top here. And this is a .NET Standard library, which means it can be reused cross-platform. And this is where we want to implement all our apps, UI, and business logic. And to start with, the project template gives you a view and a view model. So the project template starts you right off using a model view model pattern for architecting your application. So model view model, or MVVM, in case any of you aren't familiar, is just a very common application architecture for building .NET applications. And it just gives you a really clean separation between UI and business logic, so they can be worked on independently of one another without much brittleness there. So looking at what's actually in here, let me open up this XAML page. I'm using Xamarin Forms for my UI in this case, so I can reuse it cross-platform. And I want to call your attention first to what we give you with the Runtime project template. That's this map view object. Obviously, this is the UI component that allows you to display a map. And here we're actually specifying the map property via a binding, and we're saying we want to bind that to the map property of my view model. I do have a couple other things. I've cheated just a little bit and put a button and a picker control in here. A picker is essentially just a drop-down list. I just put those in there ahead of time to accelerate the demo a little bit, but they're not really doing anything just yet. So jumping over to our view model, this is exactly what you're going to get out of the box with the project template, with the only exception being that I changed the name of the class to be more specific to my use case. But other than that, exact same thing you get with the project template. And you can see this is a dead simple view model. We have property change notification wired up so that subscribers can be aware of changes in the state of my view model, of my business logic on the back end. And then we have a map property that users of this view model, in particular the view, can make use of. And that map's initialized to an ArcGIS Online streets base map. So that's how it looks in code. Let's see what our starting point actually looks like in the apps. So here it is on Windows, and then on iOS, and then on Android. And you see the map looks exactly the same. Nothing fancy, just a nice ArcGIS Online Streets base map zoomed out to the entire world. And you'll notice I have that picker control and a button up at the top. Those do differ a little bit platform to platform, basically to be more in line with the native look and feel of the platform on each of those respective operating systems. Okay, so that's our starting point. Where do we go from here? So we want to, the first thing we want to do in enabling this workflow from our users is allow them to select a neighborhood, right? Well, the first thing we need to do for that then is actually show them the neighborhoods there are. So for that, I'm going to jump back into the browser again real quick. And as Thad mentioned, ArcGIS Online is a great tool for authoring your map content for then consuming in other clients, the runtime being one. So to that end, I have a web map showing Portland neighborhoods here. And as you can see, this is zoomed into the Portland area, and I have some subtle dotted outlines of each neighborhood. So this is what I want to use for my starting point in the application. I don't want that default base map. I want to use this. So how do I swap that out? Using the Runtime SDK, how do I do that? Well, whenever you have any of those, how do I do that questions, your starting point is going to be the developer site. Specifically, if you're doing .NET development, you'll want to go to the ArcGIS Runtime SDK for .NET homepage, which you see here. And a really good place to start investigating your questions is our conceptual guide documentation. So this, as you can see along the left-hand side, covers a broad range of topics and really kind of gives you a conceptual overview of many different things you can do with our SDK. So specific to our case here, I want to show a map. So there's a working with two-dimensional maps heading there, and I can drill into displaying a map. And voila, I've got information about creating the map object from a web map. Now, no, you don't have to create a runtime map object from a web map. You could build it up layer by layer programmatically, pointing it to services or pointing to offline content. The web map is just one option for you to initialize your map. But looking further here, you'll see that we not only have a text description of how to do this, we also have code. So you see, to do this, we have this load from URI async method off of the map object, pass that a URL, and that initializes a map. But then it goes in further and talks specifically about what the supported URL formats are. So it really helps you just kind of get started. All right, so let's apply this information to our application. I'm going to jump back into Visual Studio. We don't want this ArcGIS Online base map anymore, so I'm going to get rid of that initialization. And I'm going to bring in a little code snippet. I'm going to copy paste so all of you don't need to suffer through my typos. And you'll see in this snippet, we have a call to that method, that load from URI async method, right? Off of the map object, passing it the URL to the neighborhoods web map I just showed. And of course, I want to actually call that method. And once I do that, I'm going to fire it up and see if that's changed our application. And notice over on the right-hand side here, the project in bold is my iOS project. So here I'm targeting deployment and debugging on iOS. And through some of the Xamarin magic Thad kind of talked about, even though I'm running in Visual Studio in a Windows environment, it can actually communicate with the Mac and open up the simulator and debug from within Visual Studio on Windows, just like you would if you were implementing Windows applications. All right, so we see that's fired up now, and we have our Portland neighborhoods web map. Same extent or area of interest that we defined in our web map in ArcGIS Online, same neighborhoods layer. Okay, awesome, we've gotten this off the ground. But the other part of this workflow is I want the user to be able to select one of the neighborhoods to visit, right? So the next thing I want to do is populate that drop down at the top of the screen with the list of neighborhoods. And there are a couple different ways you could go about that. You could make a call out to the service for that information. There are some other things you can do. But in this case, we already have the neighborhoods down in the application. They're right there on the screen as a layer in the map, right? So ideally, I want to just extract those neighborhoods from that layer, or in more technical terms, I want to query the layer and get that list so I can use it to populate my dropdown, right? So how am I going to do that? Well, I could jump into the guide doc again. Here, let me stop that. Or another resource you can use that has a ton of great information for you to pull from is our sample code. So here you can see, looking at the list on the left, a really extensive list of samples. Each one of these headings has a ton of samples within it. And you can kind of peruse those within the website here, or you can go out to GitHub if you want to get access to the source code, or you want to interact with us, or even try to contribute something, which we would always welcome. But one other really great way you can get access to the samples to start playing with them is the Microsoft Store, where we've actually published the samples viewer. So here I've got the store app open. So you can actually just search for ArcGIS samples, and you can see it's the first result, ArcGIS Runtime SDK for .NET samples. So right from here, you can just go get it and install it. And then you can start interacting with the samples for yourself. You don't have to actually download the source code and compile it locally. Okay, so I've already got that installed. So let's jump into the samples viewer. And again, you see you have the same list of samples on the left. You can drill into these and play around with them one by one. Or if you have something in particular you're looking to implement, you have some idea of the functionality you need, we've surfaced this search capability. Notice it's in the box in the upper right of the screen there. So here I've typed query. We want to query the data out of the layer, right? And that filters all the samples along the left-hand side down to all the samples that are relevant to querying, to whatever I type in the search box. And notice we have a sample called feature layer query. That sounds a lot like what we're looking for. I click that and it loads up, and then I can start playing with this, right? I can take the default input, or I can query for something else. So it's highlighting the feature, it's zooming to it. That's really exactly what I want to do. So the other really great thing about the samples viewer is you can also view the source code. So here now I see the source code for this sample for the UI. I can also tab over and view the code, the logic behind this sample. So looking down through the logic, I want to see how that query capability is implemented. I see we've got an onQuery clicked method. That's presumably what happens when you click the query button. That calls the query state feature method. And looking in here, it looks like we're really starting to get to the heart of it. So you can see we have a query parameters object we're instantiating. Also nice comments along the way describing step-by-step everything the sample's doing. We define a where clause to filter the results down. And then where the rubber really hits the road here is this query features async method that takes our query parameters, gives our result back, and then if we want to get a list of features, we can just cast that to a list. Okay, so I want to apply that to the app we're trying to build, right? So let's jump back over to Visual Studio. And the query capability, that's a business logic kind of thing. So I'm going to implement that in my view model. So I'm going to bring in another chunk of code that actually has the query logic within it. You see what I have here. I'm getting the feature layer that has my neighborhoods. Get the feature table off of that. So that's the table containing the data underlying the layer. Instantiating a query parameters object, just like in the sample. The only difference being I have a boilerplate query that says, give me everything. I don't want to filter it down. I want the whole list. Then I call that query features async method, passing it our query parameters, and then I get the result of that as a list. This is just some logic for sorting. That's nothing runtime specific. That's just using generic .NET link code. Now you may notice that I have some red squigglies here, right? That's because the variables, the variable names that I'm storing these things in aren't defined yet. So I could just scope those locally if I just wanted to use them within the space of the method. But that's not what I want to do with them here. In this case, so I have the query logic in my view model. I'm getting the layer, I'm getting the features. I want to allow those to be accessed outside of the view model. More specifically in this case, I want the view to be able to get a hold of them. Business logic is up here in the view model, but I want to expose some of the results of that logic out to the view. And the way you generally do that when you're implementing a view model is by surfacing some properties. So here I'm going to bring in two properties, one called neighborhood features which is just a list of feature objects, and then neighborhoods layer, which is just going to be the feature layer pointing to the neighborhoods. Okay, so that's great. That's I've got that implemented there in my view model, but I haven't wired it up to the view yet. It's great that I've got gotten hold of those set of neighborhoods programmatically, but I actually want to wire that up to my drop-down box in my UI layer, right? So how am I going to do that? So let's jump back into our UI real quick. And all I need for this on my picker control is to define this item source property. That, as you might guess, just specifies what the source of the items in the drop-down list is going to be. And in this case, I'm saying, please hook this up to the neighborhood features property on my neighborhoods view model. Pretty straightforward, right? Okay, so now we should have that populating. Now, the other thing I mentioned we wanted to do when a user selects an item from that drop-down list, we want to show that on the map, right? We want to highlight that neighborhood and zoom to it so the user has a visual representation of what they've picked. So for that, we need to figure out how to do some more stuff within runtime, the selection, the zooming. But if you remember, the sample already does that, right? If I search for another state, pardon the typos, it already zooms and selects. So how's that happening in code? So going back to our query state feature method, we already know how to do the feature that's all up here, or the query that's all up here. So for selection, if we read the comments and look at the API calls themselves, we can see on the layer we have the select feature method. We just pass it the feature we want to select. And then for zooming, we see we have the set viewpoint geometry async method that will allow us to zoom to an area of interest. So pretty simple. So let's apply that to our application. So for that, I want to go back into my view layer where we want to respond to when the user selects a different item from the drop-down list, right? So for that, we have this selected index changed event on the picker control. And I've cheated a little bit. I've already stubbed out a event handler for that, but it's empty right now. So let's bring in an implementation there. So here in this implementation, really simple. We're just getting the selected neighborhood as a feature out of the picker. I make a call to clear the selection. So if they do it multiple times, only one will be shown as selected. And then if assuming we get a feature back, then I just call the select feature method off of my neighborhoods feature layer, which we've surfaced from the view model through the property we just implemented. So that handles highlighting the feature. And then as far as zooming, we make a call to that set viewpoint geometry async method and pass it the geometry off of that feature. So let's take a quick look at how this is looking on Windows this time. So I've changed the target project to be my Windows application project. So that's going to compile down to a UWP binary and then spin that up for debugging. And when I did it on iOS, that's going to compile down to an application package on iOS. For Android, if I were targeting that, it would compile down to an APK application package. There it's deploying, starting up. We should see that same Portland Neighborhoods web map. I made that change in the shared .NET Standard project, so that should apply here. So you see we have that. And now when we expand the picker, you see we have the list of neighborhoods. And then when I pick one, it highlights, it zooms, all good to go there. Okay, so what's next in this workflow we want for our user? We still need to present them with a UI for routing to the trees of interest within the neighborhood they've selected, right? And that's why I have this next button. I want to hand that off to a different screen. So different screen, that means a different page, that means a new map. our application architecture is starting to get more complicated, right? So what's out there to help us figure out what the right way to do this? That's where I really like to point people to our open source apps. So if we jump back to our ArcGIS Runtime for .NET SDK developer site homepage, you'll see we have a link to open source apps. And what these are is essentially near production ready open source applications for you to take and customize, use as a learning tool, whatever use you can get out of them. And these have been through a full end-to-end development process from requirements and design to implementation to testing to also documentation. So here I've drilled into the open source Maps app for .NET. This is a multifunctional cross-platform Xamarin and .NET application. And you can see the documentation here is pretty extensive. It talks a lot about the different things it does. But more importantly, for our consideration with the app we're building, all of these apps we do our best to implement using best practices for the logic that's implemented, but also for the application architecture. So these are way more fully built out than samples. They get pretty complex, so they're a good place to go to try and puzzle out how it makes sense to architect your own applications. Okay, now back to the functionality we need. So I want to hand it off to a different screen. I want to, whoops. Sorry about that. I want to hand it off to a different screen. I want to have the trees that are showing, actually, let me bring up the browser again. I want to have the trees that are showing not be this whole swath of trees throughout the city, but just limited down to the neighborhood that my user selected. So essentially, I want to filter the layer by the neighborhood's geometry, right? So I need to figure out how to do that in the runtime. Well, as it happens, there actually isn't one place I can go that shows me from start to finish how I do that particular thing. And the Runtime SDK is really broad, really deep. There's a ton of stuff you can do with it. So that's going to happen from time to time, right? So what do you do when that happens? Well, jumping back to our developer site, notice in the upper right, there's a support tab. If I click on that, there's a link to Esri technical support, which they're awesome. If you have a need for dedicated technical support, by all means go there. But if you just have something like a simple question, like how do I filter a layer by a geometry, I want to call your attention to GeoNet. So here I'm on the GeoNet site in the space specific to the Runtime SDK for .NET. And here it's essentially a forum where users can ask questions and other users in the community can answer. But even beyond that, the team, we all monitor this and we try to get people the answers that they need. So especially if you have a question as straightforward as how do I filter a layer by geometry, I can almost guarantee you're going to get an answer to that quickly. Okay, so that's how you might get the answer. Now, what actually is the answer? In this case, it turns out there's a populate from service async method on the service feature table that allows you to fill a feature table with whatever particular data you might want to, specifying the filter you want to through query parameters. On your query parameters, you can specify a geometry to filter by if you want to. So, okay, that's great if you get that answer in a forum, but you don't know anything about this populate from service async method, right? So how do you find out more about that? That's where our API reference can be really useful. So if you know a specific member name or you know a specific class name, you can open up our API reference, search for that name, and here there's multiple of them. I want the one on service feature table specifically. There's two overrides for this particular method. One takes the cancellation token to give you the option of controlling cancellation of it. But drilling into one of the specific overrides, one of the specific overloads rather, you see we get a description of what the member does. But then we also get information about relevant samples. And we see that in this case, and this is, we have these linkages throughout the API reference. So I could go out and try to find this in the sample viewer, but if I find it in the API reference, I can see all the code right here and borrow from that without leaving the environment I'm already in. So if we peruse this, we see we have this manual cache feature request mode. And then here we're using query parameters again, and there's that call to the populate from service async method. So applying that back to our application one more time. Well, you know, I would love to actually go step by step and code all this up all the way through to the end. Just for the sake of time, I am going to use a little bit of time travel magic and jump to the end and just kind of hit highlights from here. So let me just step into my time machine. I'll close that partially done solution and open up this completely done one. So here in the future, you can see our little app solution's grown quite a bit. We have another view, we have a couple more view models, we even have a model layer now with some additional logic that isn't going to be surfaced directly to the UI layer. And specifically, I want to open this trees map view model. So this is the view model that provides the map with the actual trees of interest. And if you see, we have this initialized trees layer that uses manual cache mode, initializes the query parameters with the geometry specified, and then calls this populate from service async method that I mentioned. So let's see how this actually looks. Let's jump back over to Android. We haven't seen Android for a little bit. So open that up here. Select a neighborhood from the dropdown. Now we can click our next button. And you see we have the trees layer filtered down to just the trees that were in the neighborhood I selected, right? Okay. So what else do we need? Okay, well, I've got the trees there, but now I need to actually calculate a route between among the distressed trees. So I could jump back into the guide doc, try to find something there. I could jump to the samples viewer. But one other resource I want to call your attention to is our tutorials. So jumping back to our developers page once again, and actually scrolling down just below the top links, we have links to tutorials. So let's open that up. And you see, you'll see we have a ton of them, and we can filter by the various platforms and technologies. We can also filter by different functionality. You see it's already filtered by .NET. In this case, I want to filter further on routing. And you see we actually have two routing samples, one for online, one for offline. Let's click through to the one for online. And the tutorials are really great because they really take you step by step in implementing some functionality literally from scratch. They hold your hand through actually creating the solution, creating the project, and also get really detailed with handling things like authentication, base maps, actually displaying the results on the map using graphics. And then, of course, in this case, last but not least, we have actually calculating the route. So we see here for calculating the route, we use this route task object. We can create it, passing it a URL to the route service. We define the stops. In our case, this is going to be the distressed tree points. And then we make a call to a solve route async method on the route task object. So let's see how this applies to our application code. So here, back in our completed application, I have my route logic split off into this route view model class. Notice I borrowed some authentication logic from the tutorial. I've got my route task object instantiation, also borrowed from the tutorial, pointing in this case to the ArcGIS Online World Route Service. And then I've got my view model encapsulating the actual solve route call and setting up the parameters in one method, calculate route async. So I have that set up the parameters, make a call to solve route async, and return the route out. Now, I also have some logic on in the view layer to set up the graphics. I'm not going to show that here just to keep it briefer. But having a peek at how this looks, we'll jump over to iOS this time. Select a neighborhood. Maps loading up, filtering the trees layer, and then doing the actual route calculation and showing that as graphics on the map along with the stops. Okay, cool. So we're really getting somewhere. The last thing I mentioned I really wanted for my workflow, though, was to actually navigate the user to those distress trees. So I want turn-by-turn directions, right? Or turn-by-turn navigation experience. So how do where am I going to go to get started with that? So for that, I want to call your attention to our ArcGIS Runtime for .NET Demos repo. And you may want to make special note of this one. This is a little bit of an unofficial source. This is not actually linked from the developer site because this is just a repo that we've kind of used over the years to put demos in that we've kind of quickly put together for various reasons, oftentimes for conferences or other events. But there's still a lot of useful stuff in here. So you can see a lot of it listed here, and including conveniently a turn-by-turn routing demo. So let's have a quick look at how that is. I'll bring up that app here. And it's a WPF application, but as Thad was saying, the API is the same across platform, so it's still going to apply. So I'm going to put in an address here. Pardon my typing. And then it's getting the route, and now it actually has the directions, and it's giving a turn-by-turn routing experience. And it's not the prettiest experience, but you can see that the guts of it, the fundamental capability I'm looking for is there. And there's a lot of code behind this. I'm not going to get into the code specifics in this case, but I did borrow heavily from that in implementing this functionality. So take a peek at what that looks like on Windows. So I've got my neighborhood selected, filter the trees, calculate the route and show the stops on the map. And now I have this little start button that's going to launch my turn-by-turn navigation experience. So we're pretty much there on our initial requirements, right? I mean, what else would we want? Well, a bonus thing that might be nice, you'll notice that the map is rotating around. It might be nice if there were an indication to the user of which way is north, south, east, west. We want a north arrow, right? Or a compass that moves as the map rotates. Well, if you are thinking of a component like that, you might want to check our toolkit. So with the Runtime for .NET, we provide a toolkit, which is a library of reusable mapping and GIS components. So it's linked off from the developer's homepage. Here's the Git repo. It's all open source. And you'll notice in that repo, there's a sample application that will actually allow you to interactively play with the different components in the toolkit. So you see, for instance, we have a scale line. We have a whole measure toolbar that allows you to sketch on the map and get measurements, or get measurements from an existing feature. Or applicable to our case, we have a compass control. So you can see in the upper right-hand corner there's a little compass or north arrow. And when I rotate the map, it rotates along with the map. So for getting that into our app, I am going to show you that. Since this is a reusable component, pulling these things in is generally dead simple. It's just a matter of usually declaring and initializing the component. So in this case, I've opened up that second screen that has the route and the turn-by-turn navigation. You saw there's a bunch of stuff in there, but the compass is just this. Just a simple little XAML declaration, and that's all we need to bring that into our application. So taking a peek at what that actually looks like, Let's have a look on Android. Have a quick look on Windows too. There we go. Doing two platforms at the same time might not have been the best idea. My poor little machine is pretty taxed right now, but you can see it's working, and you get that nice cross-platform app experience. So that's it. So what did we just see? So you saw how you can target all our supported platforms from Visual Studio, iOS and Android and Windows. You saw how we can share code across all those platforms. There was no code difference across those platforms in this case of any of the code we added. There's those application projects that are compiler targets, but we didn't need to touch those in this case. And then you saw all the broad array of resources you can draw from to figure out how to put together the functionality you need in your apps. And with that, I will hand it back to Thad.
All righty. Yeah, that was great. So just to wrap up here, I just have one more slide to talk to, and I might have chosen the incorrect way to maybe discuss this. Pros and cons for cross-platform development with Xamarin. You know, some of these might be pros and they might be cons, kind of depending on the context and what kind of apps you're creating and what you're doing. But just to point out a couple here. For one thing, you need to realize that you have full access to all the native platform APIs. So everything that you can do, say in a native app for iOS or Android, you can do that in Xamarin as well. You have full access, and updates are delivered in sync with the underlying platform updates as well. So you'll always be able to have the functionality that's actually in the native platform. There's a large active community. That's great if you have questions. You want to run out to the forums or Google something, you can always find people that have similar problems, work around similar problems, have code examples and whatnot. Keep in mind that like Rich was targeting all of his platforms from a single IDE, Visual Studio, on a single operating system, Windows. He was hitting Android, iOS, and Windows UWP. So yeah, you can do that, but remember, if you are developing for iOS, you will have a Mac involved somehow. So you'll have to have that as a build server. All right, so with that, I'll turn it back over to Amy. I understand we might have some questions, and I'll leave this slide up with some of the resources that I pointed out if you want to take note of the URL.
All right, thank you, Thad. We're now going to begin answering the questions submitted during today's presentation. We've received just a few, and we'll try to get through those, but whatever we do not get to, if there are any left over, we will address them in a GeoNet blog post after the webinar. And as a reminder, you can still submit questions through the questions pane in the attendee control panel. Our first question is,
I'm sorry, Amy, I think you're muted.
oh, I'm sorry. We had some questions. So the first one was, when you started the project, were you using a Visual Studio project item template for ArcGIS installed with the .NET Runtime, or did you start by using a Visual Studio sample project downloaded from the developer website?
So the answer is I started that from a project template. I started it specifically from our Xamarin Forms template with .NET Standard. So we have two Xamarin Forms templates. One uses .NET Standard library project for shared code. The other uses a shared project. But I started it from a project template, not from a downloaded sample.
All right, thanks. What are things I need to consider in my code or in my UI design to ensure that my app displays well regardless of screen size, resolution, and orientation? For example, smartphones versus tablets.
Yeah, so that's a good question for mobile development in general. So in many cases, things will just kind of grow to fit the form factor. So the app I showed, for instance, you may have noticed on UWP, the window was much bigger. I could have dragged it to be as wide as I want, and all the controls would have grown to fit. So some of that has to do with how you actually specify the layout. If you're specifying the horizontal or vertical alignment to fill or to be aligned to one side or the other. But also, since you do have access to all the native platform APIs, that's one case where you may actually want to touch those native APIs to respond to larger or smaller layouts to actually deal with those, because that really gets pretty platform specific in how that works.
All right, thanks, Rich. Is there a way to create the view graphically?
Is there a way to create the view graphically? So
Like
I'm
Windows
assuming that
Forms?
means,
Like Windows Forms.
okay, so yes, so like a designer drag and drop experience. Yes, I actually didn't show it, but you can, there is a designer for Android, iOS, and of course on Windows, where you can actually interact with your layout and move things around and specify things that way. Note, however, that is basically only for the native UIs. And if you're using Xamarin Forms for your UI, there is a XAML previewer. It's not actually an interactive designer, but unfortunately, due to some technological limitations with native binary dependencies, that doesn't work with the runtime. That actually can't be made to work with the runtime. But if you're doing native UI development, so you're using the storyboard or AXML file, or you're using native Windows XAML, then you do have a full designer experience, including our components.
All right, great. Also, how will these different apps deploy on different platforms?
Okay, I'm going to guess that means from the IDE, what it gets compiled down to. So it compiles to the same application binary that you would get if you were a native Android developer using Android Studio or a native iOS developer using Xcode, or obviously Windows, it's the same thing. You'd be using Visual Studio anyway, most likely, but it compiles down to the same native binary that you'd get if you were a native platform developer. And that's a lot of why you have those separate application-specific projects. Like I mentioned, in the case I showed, those are essentially just compiler targets that control compiling down to those native platform binaries.
All right, great, thank you. And then for our last question, what are some pros and cons of cross-platform development between Xamarin and Qt?
Yeah, so the biggest one that comes to mind is with Xamarin. You have full access to all the native platform APIs, which can be important if, for instance, you need to support on iOS, you need to support something like AirPlay. There's not a way that it really makes sense to put that in an abstraction library. You need access to the actual native API. And with Xamarin, you also have the abstraction layer on top of that if you want to use that to maximize your code sharing. On Qt, it is fundamentally an abstraction library. That's the way the technology is. So you do have access to many of the native platform things. They provide abstractions for sensors and things of that sort, and as much as they can. But some things you wouldn't have access to in the same way that you do when you're developing with Xamarin. Aside from that, obviously there's a difference in developing with QML and C# in Qt Creator versus developing with .NET and C# in Visual Studio. And that's which you find preferable is going to vary by your expertise and what your development preferences are.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Rich and Thad, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar, Build Cross-Platform Mobile Mapping Apps with .NET and Xamarin. If you have any other questions, please feel free to contact me using my email address in your follow-up email. Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation, and we would greatly appreciate it if you would complete that and provide some of your feedback. We will be providing a recording of this presentation, which will be available within 7 to 10 business days on the go.esri.com/geodev page. On behalf of Esri and our presenters, thank you for joining us today and have a great rest of your day.